Hello and welcome to the Lib Dem Podcast with me, your host, Owen Lambert. Today, on the final day at time of recording of LGBT History Month, I am honoured to be joined by our diverse panel, Jen Yockney Mbe, which of course stands for More Bisexuals Elected, which is a great acronym, I 100% agree. Jennie Rigg, be very nice to her and your candidate assessment may go through, even if you are from Lancashire. And Lucy Tonge, illustrious exec member of Plus, diversity rep for the Young Liberals and avid Animal Crossing fan. Welcome, everybody.
Hey, hello.
So today we'll be discussing what LGBT History Month is, how things have indeed changed for our queer community, what still needs to improve, and of course, how the Liberal Democrats have played a huge part in this. And I'd like to start with a little bit of background, and for that I'd love to turn to Jen and Jennie for their experiences.
Okay. In terms of Lib Dem stuff or LGBT stuff or both?
We're going to go for both because this is, it's our month in terms of looking at our collective history. But of course, being the Lib Dem pod, it's nice to see how the party has made their little impact on it.
And also, being bisexuals, we want to embrace the power of and.
Of course.
So my queer history is, I grew up under Section 28. So I didn't actually realise that I was queer for quite some time, because I knew I fancied boys, so the fancying girls as well must be some kind of weird, quirk or something. Didn't even know what bisexual was, because that was stuff that we weren't allowed to be told. So I was 28 when I came out, and spent the next, God, how old am I now? Years. Going, how the hell did I ever think I was straight? Huge crush on Gillian Anderson in The X-Files, but that didn't mean I was queer in any way at all. Not long after I came out as bi, I also joined Lib Dems. And again, that was not so much something that I was unaware. I knew I was a liberal, but I'd been kind of fighting against joining a political party, because I thought that joining a political party meant that you had to agree with everything that the political party said. And then I went to conference and discovered that actually in the Lib Dems you can make party policy, and kind of fell in love with it from there. I joined Plus at that first conference by being persuaded by a certain Ms. Yockney to sign up to. I was wandering around the exhibition and thought, oh, there's someone with nice blue hair, I'll go and talk to her. Handed over my fiver, went to the AGM and thought, yeah, I think I've found my people here. So it all happened in a relatively short time, but I think it had been coming for quite a while, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And yeah, the Lib Dems have done amazing things for LGBT history, which I am sure we will cover in depth on this call. And, same-sex marriage being the flagship, but not by any means the total. Yeah. And I think I've gone on enough now, and it's Jen's turn.
Yeah, I have a couple of years in age on Jennie, so most of my schooling was before Section 28 became law. But that crucial sort of puberty kind of age of mid-teens was when it was coming in. And I was not sure where I was politically. I knew it was the 80s. I knew I wasn't conservative because Mrs. Thatcher and I grew up in the South Wales coal mining belt, and no. But equally, I'd seen how equally venal, self-serving and corrupt the Labour Party was to the Conservatives because I grew up in a Labour-rotten borough. And so I knew I wasn't either of those. I was somewhere kind of lefty, don't really know, Plaid Cymru, Green Party, Liberal, something, and just watching all those kinds of parties really in my teens. As Section 28 became law, I was not yet out, so I was cutting newspaper articles out and sticking them on my bedroom wall like a good little politics geek about this thing and being enthusiastically on the side of this cause against this terrible thing that the Conservatives and Labour, let's remember the Conservatives and Labour were uniting to do to us. but it didn't necessarily yet make me a liberal, and it didn't necessarily yet make me one of those queers, because that was a big leap to make sort of mentally, which I then made. One of my big sisters worked out something was going on, clearly, came home one weekend, left a copy of the book Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit on the kitchen table, which I immediately read because, oh, look, there's a new book in the house. I went, oh! And suddenly this neuron here in my brain connected to this one, and I went, oh, I'm bisexual. So came out to my sixth form, was interested in, LGB, as they were talked about then, really LG rights, whilst knowing that I didn't quite fit the LG labels. But then went away to university at Manchester. During my term at Manchester was the 1992 general election, where the Lib Dems just managed to hold themselves together and not completely implode after the horrors of the end of the alliance. But during that, we had Paddy Ashdown being interviewed by Jeremy Paxman and raising the lesbian, gay and bisexual content in the 1992 manifesto, and saying, in your manifesto it says that you want to equalise the age of consent so that young gay men can have sex at 16 just like their straight peers, and so you want to abolish section 28 so that young gay people get told that they exist. Being Jeremy Paxman, he didn't word it quite that positively, but Paddy listened to this question, and it would have been so easy in the culture of that time to fudge, to shy away, whatever, but Paddy just went straight into bat on it hard and said, yeah, we don't stand for these things because they are popular, we stand for these things because they are right. And I just punched the air at my television and now had the where do I stand on out of these political parties thing crystallised really nicely for me in a, neither of the others are standing up for this properly, they are, I shall go and join the Liberals as soon as I can. It was the days before the internet, so I had to wait until the following September and join up at a stall at a university freshers' fair, because how on earth do you join a political party before the internet? It's a mystery. And really, for me, the thing has been, at that point where I joined, the Liberals were very much at the front end of sort of party political discourse around LGBT rights. They weren't perfect. There were definitely things that I wanted to see extra. And there was a lot of talking about lesbians and gays rather than lesbian, gays and bisexuals. And there was trans being very much at that point a sort of off-sideline kind of issue. The Lib Dem MP Alex Carlisle at about that time was meeting with a bunch of people and explaining with them how to lobby successfully for trans rights, which led to the creation of Press for Change, which for a long time was the trans rights group equivalent to what Stonewall was for lesbian and gay people. But over time then, there was how we reacted to things, which was fantastic. In 1994, for example, when we nearly got an equal age of consent through, but enough Labour MPs voted it down that it didn't get through. If they'd managed to make them sit on their hands, we'd have had an equal age of consent 7 years earlier. But where Labour was split, where the Tories were split very much one way, and Labour was split mostly okay, but quite a lot of bad, the Liberals, every single Liberal who turned up and voted through the right lobby, and the only one who didn't was, I don't know, somewhere else abstaining, whatever, maybe something else was going on in their life, but fundamentally, if someone was turning up and going, this is a Liberal voice, they went and voted the right darn way on our rights. And that kind of thing, just in the same way that Jenny says about the social aspect at conference, the sitting there and seeing these things was brilliant for reinforcing you want to be a Lib Dem. And then slowly over the years, I'm going to let Owen chip in because I've similarly rambled on a bit, but then you start learning the sort of the prehistory of what happened before you came in, and that becomes even more reinforcing as a Liberal that you're in the right place, I feel.
Definitely. I mean, I was quite struck by when I turned up to the LGBT plus event for our History Month, and it was Bernard Greaves actually that made an excellent point. He said, "Equality is equality, and you cannot compromise on that." And it's, like I say, harkening back to what Paddy was fighting for all those years ago, and it's still part of the liberal message. It's still core to our values, and it's what's guiding our values sort of into the future.
Hello, John from the Lib Dem Podcast here. We are delighted to say that this episode is sponsored by Prater Rains. Now more than ever, you need a professional-looking online presence and website. Prater Rains have been helping Liberal Democrat campaigns succeed for 18 years. Their LibDem Foci package combines a website, social media and email system to help LibDems win. You'll receive great support from real people, fair pricing and a huge range of features to choose from. Prater Rains are already the bespoke developers for Lighthouse, LibDem Draw Online and the LD Directory. They combine a talented system design with an unrivaled understanding of our party, our data and our systems. To find out more, check out the Prater Rains website at praterrains.co.uk/liberal-democrats. This podcast has been sponsored by the Katora Coffee Club, the UK's most environmentally friendly coffee club. There are over 400 independent roasters in the UK, each one crafting coffee in their own unique style. Katora Coffee Club works with some of the best to take you on a voyage of coffee discovery. The Katora Coffee Club delivers ethically sourced and independently roast coffee directly to your door. Each month you'll receive between 2 and 4 bags of coffee and their monthly extract magazine. Even better for LibDem podcast listeners, use the code BETTERCOFFEE to save 5% on subscriptions and gift boxes for a limited time only. All Katora Coffee Club boxes are carbon negative and offset the CO2, so why not do some good, enjoy some great coffee and check out the website www.katoracoffeeclub.com. Now, back to the podcast.
I suppose it would be interesting to see what all of you actually believe was our landmark moment for LGBT plus rights. Where do you believe the party was at its best in recent years in standing shoulder to shoulder with the queer community? And I'd like to actually go to our youngest panelist here, Lucy, and see what you believe on that matter.
So I joined the party in 2015, so obviously haven't got a particularly long period that I've been very aware of what was going on in the party. But I think one of the things that, kind of looking back a bit further, obviously same-sex marriage, as Jenny has already said, was kind of the landmark thing that everybody knows about. Well, everyone in the Lib Dems knows about, as much as Labour like to claim that one. But I think more recently, actually the fact that we've been pushing for things like mentioning the blood ban, and kind of the issues that have been long-running issues that, as you say, rather than just mentioning them when they're popular and when they're an issue that are that's kind of in the news at the time and kind of profiting off that it's things that have already got publicity, things like the blood ban, the fact that I'm fairly sure Tim Farron was the first person to mention what was going on in Chechnya a couple of years ago, and those sort of things. I think I can't kind of point specifically to one thing, but I think the fact that there are issues that generally, when they're not already getting a lot of publicity, and it's not exactly politically expedient for us to be raising them, it's not something we're doing because it's a convenient time and it's going to look good for the party kind of overall and in Parliament, but they're things that need to be mentioned, and actually we've kind of stuck our head above the parapet and thought these are important issues, and whatever other things are going on, whether it be the cursed B word or Brexit discussions going on, it doesn't matter whether that's still happening. Whatever's happening in Chechnya is still important, and if there are changes going on with the blood ban, which I know is great that it's kind of been, I'd say, changed recently, it's obviously not entirely gone, but those sort of things, I think, although I can't point to one particular thing, it's raising those issues that aren't popular, but raising them because they need to be raised. And as Jenny and Jen have both said, it hasn't been an issue whether or not those are popular issues. It's been it's principle within the party that if they need to be mentioned, they're mentioned, whether or not it's going to be something that benefits us as a party in the kind of wider political sphere.
No, I agree, and it's quite interesting that you mentioned Chechnya as a key point. I was in a Plus call not too long ago, and they had a speaker in talking about all the injustices that were happening to the queer community in Poland. And I found it absolutely, invigorating that our party was not only standing up for the rights of queer people in this country, but also internationally. And that's quite a clear difference, I think, for our party compared to a lot of the other parties in the United Kingdom. I think we'll move now to Jennie, talking about what you believe what you think the watershed moment is in terms of our party with the queer community.
I mean, it's kind of like Lucy says, it's always there as a background. It's been in the manifesto since the 70s, it's just part of our DNA as a party. I would like to say on the same-sex marriage thing, the first big pride that I went to after the Same-Sex Marriage Act came in was a Manchester Pride. And you guys know how regimented Manchester Pride is. You've got to all have your name in the little book and everything. And I went to join the Lib Dem contingent, and we started the march. And as we're going round the route, there were a bunch of people sticking their ring fingers up, pointing at their wedding rings and saying thank you. So although Labour and the Tories like to try and claim it, I think the community in general knows why they've got same-sex marriage. In terms of in recent years, stuff that we've done that's landmark, I would have to say how we fought for trans rights. I mean, Sal Brinton as president was amazing. Jo as leader, they tried to hammer her on it and she just wasn't having it. No, this is a line I won't cross. And, even yesterday or the day before, what day are we on? Sunday, the day before, in the Lords, Liz Barker did an amazing speech that was just no, this is a line I will not cross. You are using the same arguments used against us in the 80s to fight against trans people now. She was speaking from her point of view as a lesbian. And, it's just not on, and stop it. So, we have been so steadfast and vocal on trans rights, and yes, there are one or two idiots in the party that don't go the right way on it, but mostly, and in terms of the leadership, we have been really, really steadfast on it, and that's something I'm really proud of, because none of the other parties, I mean, not Labour or the Tories, but not the Greens, not the SNP, not Plaid, none of the other parties are good on trans rights.
Absolutely. I mean, when they seem to flip-flop. I've watched the Greens be against me and in favour of me and against me and in favour of me, kind of like a weather vane over the years that I've been paying proper attention to these things since the 80s. I'm going to, as a greedy buyer, I'm going to go for two things in answer to this question, Owen, because you'd expect nothing less of me, would you? One, touching back on something that we just did, was Section 28, because one of the things for me, as well as, yes, we were the only party to consistently oppose it from day one. All the stuff of how, yes, it got repealed in Scotland because the Lib Dems made it a condition of going into coalition government. It got repealed in England and in Wales because Ed Davey moved it as an amendment when Labour kept letting us down on that. But the thing for me, at the very start of Section 28, you need to remember where we were as a party. It was halfway through the merger between the SDP and the Liberals. We couldn't even agree what our name was as an organisation, and we could still absolutely unitedly stand up and say, this thing is wrong, of course we're against it, and we're against it every darned inch of the way. And, when you're that lacking an identity as a party, almost those kinds of things become so good for holding, I think, a movement together, that you understand exactly what it is that you're for, even if you haven't quite hammered out which way round to put the letters in the acronym. And so there's that. The other thing, because that's an outward-facing thing, there's an inward-facing thing, which is back in the 1970s, the peer education programme within the party that Gordon Lishman and Bernard Greaves worked on together. And at a time where, there was no internet to get that sort of, information and support from, having an education programme of people going round to local parties up and down the country explaining, this is what you've been told about lesbians and gay men, it was the 70s. That was, the extended acronym in those days had 2 letters, not 1. This is what you've been told about lesbians and gay men. This is the truth. This is why their liberation is a liberal issue that you should support. And I think actually that's something that, especially within our party, because uniquely we've got an ideology where that's a totally coherent sentence, but in the other parties as well, actually, I would love to see their LGBT groups doing equivalent things for their mass membership as well, because that's part of how we change the hearts and minds. And I remember about 10 years ago in Spain, there was a general election. They brought in same-sex marriage, and it became a election deciding sort of issue. Should we keep same-sex marriage? Should we get rid of it? And I don't want that. I actually want every party to have a thriving, successful LGBT organisation that influences its policy, so that no matter whether the voters vote for the people I think are the right people to vote for, or whether they vote for someone I think is absolutely awful in 101 ways, again, nonetheless, my basic human rights are still equally protected and respected regardless of who gets in. But obviously the best way to do that is to vote Liberal, because it's actually in our DNA rather than something that we've bolted on afterwards.
No, quite right. I think it's very important that you've mentioned that, actually, that to say that, it's not just an issue that we take up, although it is one that is comes more naturally to the Liberal Democrats, that it should be an issue taken apart by politics across the spectrum, that basic human rights be the focus, which sort of leads me more into talking about the nows and todays. So where we're going forward, I mean, we've touched on the fact that, of course, nowadays the trans community is certainly under a lot more, a threat and attack from national newspapers, from particularly influential people on social media, not to name any names, of course, but so what is it that Plus is doing now, working alongside the Lib Dems, to move our policies forward, to protect, I suppose, and to shine a light on the problems that, especially trans, but still the queer community is facing? Lucy and Jenny, of course, being members on the exec of Plus, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what the group is doing at this time.
I think following on from what Jenny was just saying about trans rights, that's one of the things that has been consistently something which we've unfortunately had to issues in the in the media, most recently things like the Tavistock ruling, and kind of responding to those issues, but just also consistently sticking with the policy as a party that trans rights are non-negotiable. It's not something that we're willing to have a debate over. I'm quite happy to have debates over policy, but something that I will not debate about is somebody's identity and whether or not it's valid. And I think that's something which we've come back to time and time again. And as Jenny said, we can't make sure that every single member in the party is fundamentally pro-trans rights, but what we can do is make sure that when we have issues with a particular person, we can as our first port of call, try and make sure that if it's a misunderstanding, or if it's the fact that somebody has, there is so much information out there. I know people personally who their information has come from like the Times, or they come out with lines that they would never have come up with by themselves. Things about the Olympics, but what about the Olympics? Well, I'm not sure how that's entirely relevant. Things like obviously about toilets, things about what about the children, all of these things which knowing that person, they never would have come out with if they hadn't have read it somewhere. And I think we kind of, although there are a lot of people out there who have malicious intent towards trans people and are actively trying to undermine trans rights, we have to take into consideration that there are also people who they've been exposed to a lot of transphobic media, which, in such a big problem in the UK, and also just don't understand the issues. If they do not have trans friends, if they do not have LGBT friends at all, they don't have any involvement with the community, that we should go in with a mindset of, okay, well, let's give them the benefit of the doubt and assume it's something that we can have a conversation about. If they've got, things that need debunking, that they've, lines that they've got from newspapers or from people on Twitter, that should be the first port of call rather than going in and attacking them. And that's something which is, it's a kind of a rolling issue, which we kind of really take kind of a proactive approach on trying to make sure that everybody knows that we are pro-trans rights, and that's not something we're budging on. And that extends to our MPs, making sure that if there is something that they do wrong, that we make sure that we speak to them about it, that we educate them if they need to be given advice and need to be given ways to educate themselves, making sure that we work with people to give training to MPs, their staff, to anybody in the party who wants it. And that's been such a big part of what we've done since I've been on the exec anyway over the last year. Obviously Jenny having been involved for a lot longer than me and having been chair, and Jen also, I'm sure has a lot more to say about kind of the longer running issues, but that's been something that's been such a major part of being on the exec since I have been.
So yeah, in terms of practical things that we've been doing over the last few months, we've run one training event that all bar one of the MPs turned up to. We've run a training event for MP staff to make sure that they can spot the transphobic dog whistles and stuff. We've written a sort of how-to guide on spotting transphobic dog whistles, which is on the website. I can drop you the link so you can put it in the show notes if you wanna. We had a couple of meetings with Candy, who does the disciplinary training and stuff. She is very receptive and has been using our training materials. We've done loads and loads of practical training and outreach to try and yes, this year we have mostly been doing stuff on the trans rights, but that's because certainly the LNG are just, we don't really need to do training on that anymore, because certainly at HQ and with the parliamentary people, they're just on board with it. It's just normal. We have in the past done stuff about biphobia and bi rights, because that's a little bit less normal and accepted than the LNG. But yeah, plus is doing training and outreach in places where it's needed, but in a lot of places with our party, it's not really needed with it.
I should just say as well that there was a couple of events for Bi Visibility Day or that Jen ran that were brilliant, just about bi history, and I know that that's something that I'm very aware of. I'm trying to educate myself more on obviously LGBT plus history more widely, but also just specifically on bi history, because it's not something that is easy to access. And having somebody like Jen, who obviously has a lot of knowledge in that area, and there are other people within the party who are brilliant in being able to run events. I know that Jazz, who's our membership secretary of Plus, has been involved with running events, and who's also on the exec. But having people in the party who've got a lot of knowledge, that there are so many people who want to be able to access and knowledge about your own community, being able to run events with those people and give them an opportunity to kind of share that knowledge and the history with other members of the party, whether it be younger members of the party or also older members of the party who aren't as aware, or whether they came out later than other people. It's really nice to be able to kind of share that amongst the community within the party. And people like Jen running those events were really, really brilliant, or especially on kind of visibility and awareness days.
So speaking of events, a little bit of a plug here. We had our first LGBT plus queer quiz this month. We decided to launch it in LGBT History Month for obvious reasons. The one next month is going to be written by me and is going to be bi-themed. So there will be lots of bisexual things you can learn about at that if you don't know them, and if you do know them, you might win the quiz and you might win a prize. It's the last Friday of the month at 7 o'clock. Plug, plug, plug.
So that'll be the 26th.
Fantastic. I think I'll make a concerted effort to try and get down to that one, because that's a little bit of a niche thing that I know things about. It's fantastic to hear that, you know, we've got so many training sessions and bits of literature and information out there that we can use within the party to inform our members, you know, about what is acceptable, about our history, all the things that we've achieved, which I'm sure can all be found on the Plus website. Moving slightly away from looking internally and looking externally, how best do you think Plus, and then of course the Liberal Democrats as a whole, should be pushing, sort of informing the wider British public about, you know, about the struggles of the queer community at this time?
I guess, I mean, one of the things is we already have ways in which we communicate with people through focus leaflets and that kind of thing, which has been a bit tricky over the course of the pandemic because of some of the issues around delivering. And so we've also become a little bit stronger at doing Facebook and other content. And I think part of it is using some of those additional things that we've learned, these kinds of podcasts and so on. You know, I mean, I think of really that way in which people telling little snippets of their own stories leads people to learn stuff that they wouldn't otherwise. I think of a time where I was out leafleting with another Lib Dem at a parliamentary by-election, and we were saying, sort of, you know, after we finish leafleting, what are we doing? Do you want to come to the pub, kind of thing, like every Lib Dem on a leafleting round pretty much has said at some point. And I said, no, I'm off. I'm going to go. My partner lives fairly nearby, and I'm going to go and meet them, and we're going to have dinner with their parents. And I got the usual thing that, bless him, straight cis bloke, the natural response, oh God, the dreaded in-laws, roll your eyes kind of thing. And I was like, no, actually for me, the majority of the time with partners over the years, I haven't gotten to meet their parents, either because they're not out to their parents, or because the response that their parents maybe gave to them coming out, or the attitudes their parents have expressed towards other queer and trans people. They've said, actually, meeting my parents would be too traumatic. I don't want to put either of us through that. And so for me, getting to go and have a really nice, accepting, you know, Saturday night dinner with the not married, but the metaphorical in-laws is a really heartening kind of thing. And I think that's the sort of thing that someone who's picked up basics about sort of lesbian and gay struggles and the age of consent and that sort of thing, they have those ideas, but they don't understand how that translates into individual real life experiences. And this probably isn't something that you could do the whole of that in a focus leaflet, in a little boxy article, but in your focus, you can be linking to things like the LGBT History Timeline on Plus's website, and that could then lead out to other things that have, you know, because there's room on that which we haven't utilised properly yet, to add video content and stuff like that, where we could maybe help people to learn some of those stories and some of those little, the internal nuances of LGBT life that don't make for campaigns, that don't make for a write to your MP sort of an issue, but that are actually about why is it different. There's something that I like to talk about called the bisexual burden, which is compared even to lesbians and gay men having to keep on coming out over and over again, because you get into a 10-year relationship with someone and everyone around you goes, oh, you've picked a side, you've decided which one you are. And you haven't. You're still every bit as darn bisexual as you were on day one. It's just you happen to be in a monogamous relationship with someone who has one gender, and therefore that's the gender you're dating right now. But it doesn't tell anyone anything about when you're sitting there watching a rerun of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which characters you might be going, oh, they're so pretty about. So
Vampire Willow.
Other attractive characters are also available, though not necessarily in PVC. But to me, that's the thing, is taking that kind of the resources that the party has got out there, and maybe as an organisation we could look at building those up so that people get that deeper, richer stuff. also talking about some of the issues that are starting to come up for LGBT people that aren't as simple, straightforward in the way, like I say, we used to go, scrap Section 28, allow people to adopt children on an equal basis of whether you're a safe, responsible parent in a good home for that child. But for example, I'm in Manchester, and here in Manchester and also next door in Salford, there are projects under development at the moment to create sheltered housing focused on LGBT older people. Because actually sometimes services, saying that a service is equal isn't the same as saying that a service is appropriate. And if you are, if you spent all of your life being maybe the only gay man on your street, suddenly finding you're the only gay man in your retirement home could feel, if you're now no longer able to get out to Canal Street or whatever your local place is, you could feel far more isolated than ever before. But also that how we run those services to me is important as someone who's bi and trans, that, for example, if two people move into that as a couple, let's say a lesbian and a bi woman who've been together for years and years, the lesbian dies, the bi woman, her next late life relationship comes along and it's with a guy, is that space still accepting and welcoming for her, even though she now perhaps feels, because of the historic experiences of biphobia in the lesbian and gay community, like, am I still going to be accepted in here? And so there are a whole load of things about how we live our day-to-day lives that I think are kind of the story going forward, and something that as liberals we can talk about, that make LGBT people three-dimensional rounded human beings instead of just a voting demographic.
I think as well as that, I've kind of been more accepted in LGBT spaces despite having opposite sex partners, I think, because I'm poly, and that kind of, so that, oh, well, yeah, okay, so you might be having an opposite sex relationship, but you're not normal, so we'll accept you.
You've got blue hair, it's clearly...
yeah, but I think, the struggle of being a bi person in an opposite sex relationship is one that really needs to be hammered home to people. Because you do still get, not just from straight people, but from lesbian and gay people, you do still get, oh, well, you've picked a side then, haven't you? And that's, I'm definitely not straight. Definitely not straight.
I mean, that's a story that resonates personally with me, Jenny. I feel that boat rocking consistently. I agree with everyone. It's very, very important that we highlight and show the individual stories and put them out there to people, so that wider society can sort of go, oh, this is how Jeff down the road is experiencing things. I don't know anyone in the queer community called Jeff, but there we go. There's a new icon that we can all gather around. Jeff the queer.
I shall point this out to the chair of FCC and see what he thinks.
Sorry, Jeff, we voted you an icon. It's an extra thing you have to do from now on.
One of the things that I hadn't thought about earlier when you were asking about kind of landmark moments, I think kind of now I think about it, I think the fact that we finally got to a point when inclusive SRE, sex and relationships education, is going to be such a big thing kind of going forward for younger people. Because I mean, I have an auntie who's gay, and so from a very young age, I was just aware of the fact that sometimes men love men, sometimes women love women. That's the thing, and I didn't question it. So that I think the fact that I knew that going forward, when people started using the word gay to, that's gay, this is gay, oh, stop being so gay, I was really confused, because I thought, well, I thought I knew what gay meant, and that doesn't match up with what I was thinking. But obviously so many of the people I was at school with, their first experience of gay was hearing other people use it as a descriptor. And so many people who didn't have any. I knew a couple of other people who had a gay auntie, and we're the people with the gay aunties. We've got something in common. But there were so many people who had as far as they were aware, had no interaction with anybody who was LGBT, and so had no information. I was 6 by the time Section 28 was abolished. So there were, people who we weren't. It was sorry, Jenny, making you feel old. But I think there was so much that now there are kind of a generation of people sort of around my age, and kind of we were all sort of learning at the same time, and there wasn't anything. And the fact that obviously now we've got the internet to be able to search stuff and look at whatever resources there are available makes such a big difference. But people before, who were slightly older than me, that didn't have the access to the internet, that were, in education throughout Section 28 being enforced, I think the fact that we now have that education available, and I think something that we as a party should kind of stand by, is the fact that we shouldn't be kind of prudish about what age that education starts at, and having age appropriate sex education that is inclusive doesn't mean going into the gritty details of sex between different partners at a young age, because that's not what that 5-year-olds are taught anyway. 5-year-olds are taught that a man and a woman fall in love and they get married, and they have a special hug and make babies, whatever it is, I don't know. But it's like just to be able to say a man and a woman can fall in love and get married, but also so can a man and a man, sometimes so can a woman and a woman. And also, sometimes people don't feel like, they might be called a girl and actually not feel like a girl. And that's enough. That's, to be able to tell younger children that is enough, because that is kind of at least give them an inkling. I have friends who are trans who had no idea that trans was a thing until finally coming across something on the internet and thinking, oh, okay, well, I felt this way since I was 3 or 4, and I've not had a name to put to it. Had I have known this could have saved me years of internal struggle and pain and having to socialize myself. And the fact that being able to actually teach younger children that even just so much as sometimes you might feel like a boy and you're not a boy, you might be a girl, and that's a thing, and it's okay, and you can talk about that, will make such a big difference to so many people. And I think that we need to keep, as we have done with trans rights, sticking by the fact that it might not be a popular opinion amongst a lot of people that it should start at a younger age. However, we should kind of keep on at that, and regardless of whether it is politically expedient for us, we should stand by it, because it's something that we believe, and it's something that will make a difference to people. And it might not make us fill up the House of Commons, but let's be honest, that wasn't looking likely anyway. So we may as well stick by our principles, and that, I think, hadn't thought about that earlier, but kind of as a landmark thing and something we can do within the party, but also more widely, is kind of, I think that will make such a big difference to so many people, at the time, but also just throughout their lives. Because if you start off with letting people know, then it's you're building a basis for people to then go on through the rest of their lives, feel like they are able to talk about those things and not have to keep them secret.
So I'd like to speak to that a little bit from a parental point of view, because my kid just turned 17 at junior school. I don't know how typical this is, but we do live in Calderdale, and Calderdale is famously quite accepting of LGBT stuff, so it may not be typical across the country, but I think 7 years old, the teacher of his class, actually a friend of mine, was a bisexual lady in a same-sex relationship, got married, talked to the kids about getting married to her female partner. When he was at senior school, the group of friends that he ran round with, one of them was bi, one of them was lesbian. They have an LGBT society at his college that, there are posters up with rainbows on saying, come and join us, we're lovely people. And, so from the point of view of the generation that's coming up now, who have had more inclusive education and are hopefully going to continue to have more inclusive education, I have so much hope. I have so much hope, because it's just normal to them. Yeah, okay, so some people are gay, get over it, to pinch a slogan from Stonewall. To kids of my kids' generation, this stuff is so much more normal than it ever was for ours. And even, like, Lucy is so much younger than me, but there has been such a sea change in the last 5 to 10 years, and it is so beautiful to see.
And you look at this week, we saw new opinion polling from Gallup in America, where they've done some big survey of the order of 10,000 people and extrapolated data on how many people identify as LGBT or T or none of those, and allowing them to tick more than one box. But they've broken it down by generation as well. So you have kind of, I think from memory, 0.3% of baby boomers identify as bi, and 0.5% of them identify as lesbian or gay. But of course, they grew up in a world, you imagine growing up at a time where sex between men was illegal, being outed in the workplace who cost you your job like that, and all those sorts of things. So it was very hard. You had no sort of public role models and that kind of thing. It was very hard to take on and own those kind of labels and incorporate them into who you were. You bring it right down to the Generation Z, the kids who have just been able to vote for Joe Biden now, and forgive me my age that I'm calling them kids when they're going, I'm 18, I'm an adult. But you know exactly what I mean by that compared to the baby boomers. And in that generation, it's 3.5% that identify as lesbian or gay, not 0.5%. And it's not 0.3% identifying as bisexual, it's 15%. And that, to me, is a story of the impact of making it acceptable to pick up a label. And the thing that I always say about labels, because people think, oh, labels can be restrictive and box you in and carry all this sort of stigma. And to me, it's not. It's the stereotypes and stigma that we've wrapped labels up in. But because we've started to break that down so much for these younger generations compared to the boomers, compared to my generation, that now that huge chunk, whatever that is, about 1 in 6, 1 in 7 of the population, being able to feel that they can pick up this label, it feels like it works for me. I'm going to have this as a word that I use to articulate who I am to other people for as long as it's helpful to me. And we aren't there we're still not there by a long way on actually getting rid of all the stigma and all the social cost of identifying as LGBT or T. But how far have we got that you're able to look at that shift, that someone do the maths for me, 0.3 up to 15, that's about 50 times the rate of people being able to feel they can be honest about themselves. That's damn beautiful.
I go back to the fact that it was in 1990 that Peter Tatchell founded Outrage. 1990. I mean, I was at senior school, it's it's just outside the last 30 years that it was so bad that he felt he had to found Outrage. And yeah, how far we've come. I've got to keep going.
I don't have anywhere near as profound a point as those, but in the last couple of weeks, this is a cultural reference, in the last couple of weeks, a new series of Tracy Beaker has come out. And Tracy Beaker is something which was one of my favourite TV programs as a kid, and my mum used to refer to me as Tracy Beaker when I was having a tantrum, because it was something that I loved, and I read the book and I watched the TV show, and I used to go as Tracy Beaker on World Book Day. I went 1 year as Stig of the Dump, but that was the rest of the time always. And it's so interesting to see kind of over the last couple of weeks, because when Tracy Beaker was first written, Section 28 was still law, and the kind of, obviously Jacqueline Wilson is gay, and the fact that at the time it was written, it's the character of Cam seems to be so heavily queer coded, and even in the TV show at the time. And I remember thinking when I was 6 or 7, thinking that there is something about Cam. There was something about her, and I can't work out what it is, but she's different somehow. And I don't think I would have put, said, I think she's gay, because, you know, I wouldn't have done it at that time. But it's so interesting now to see so many people who are, you know, like me, in their early 20s, mid-20s, going back to watch this new series. Because, spoiler alert, if anybody is planning to watch the new series of Tracy Beaker, but going back to watch it, and they've been saying that the amount of people in their 20s and the viewing figures going back to watch it, because it's resolving the fact that in the earlier series, Cam was married to a man, and there was like outrage over this because so many people were saying, well, Cam is, you know, this doesn't seem right. And in this new series, Cam at the end of it marries a woman. And it's kind of, I know so many people my age who just think, this just feels like the kind of the kind of climactic point that everybody was waiting for, the original, you know, the first time round, but it couldn't happen. And, you know, 10 years later, well, it's not even 10 years, 15 years later, and finally, all of these people who were watching it at the time and kind of thinking this hasn't worked out quite how I thought, are watching the ending that everybody wanted at the time. And it's really nice to see all these people my age going back and watching it thinking, this is what we wanted to happen, and it couldn't at the time. It, you know, it would have been illegal for it to have been written that way at the time, and now it feels like it's come to an ending that feels right to everybody. You know, being in our 20s and watching Tracy Beaker again, and it was just really nice to see people on Twitter saying, I've waited 10 years for this, and finally it's happened. And it's, you know, it's so nice to watch this, and also know that there are younger kids who haven't watched Tracy Beaker before who are watching this, and this big new series that is being pushed, and there is a same-sex marriage at the end of it, and it's really nice to see that on kind of one of their big new series that's had a big push, and that so many people are watching my age, but also, you know, younger kids who are watching it. It's been so lovely to see the comments on Twitter.
No, it's fantastic. Of course, you know, Section 28 wouldn't have been repealed without the spearheading, I suppose, by our current party leader Ed Davey and his passion for removing it. It was actually interesting earlier, Lucy, you made a point about how obviously we've been saying all throughout this podcast how we don't do things because they are popular, we don't do things because they are easy, we do things because they are right. And those things don't get us seats in the House of Commons. However, one of our recent podcasts, we made a bit of a discussion talking about sort of working alongside other parties. And I suppose I'd love to hear from you all as a sort of closing point, how best we can work with, if we can work with Labour, with the Conservatives, with all the smaller parties to push forward LGBT plus rights, even working with other organisations, you know, with Stonewall, to make the LGBT plus experience so much better. Is that something that we can do as the Liberal Democrats?
I mean, we do have good contacts with Stonewall and the Terence Higgins Trust from Plus. But I think I know I've mentioned it already, but going back to same-sex marriage, the way that particularly Lynn Featherstone, but the party in general, managed to persuade the Tories that this was not only something that was good and right, because it was, but that it would be politically acceptable to their voters. You know, and Lynn did amazing work on that. She turned Theresa May completely around. And yes, I have huge problems with Theresa May, but on LGBT rights, she's not actually that bad. And that's mostly down to having conversations with Lynn when they were working in the same department. I think we can work with other parties. You know, I've been to, when I was chair of Plus, I've been to joint events with LGBT Tories and LGBT plus Labour and the Greens, where they've had an event where somebody has invited all of the LGBT organisations from all of the parties to come and meet together. And, you know, that sort of thing, yeah, we have more in common with, I would say, the LGBT organisations in other parties than they necessarily have with the rest of their parties. It was very strange at one of the events that it was kind of like a Trooping the Colour thing. I don't know exactly what the name of it was, but there was something very military going on that we were all watching. And yeah, reactions of some of the other, particularly the Tories, like holding the fist to the chest for the national anthem and stuff, which felt very alien to me. But at the same time, we were all there in the same room, talking to each other, having conversations. You know, what's your party doing on X? What's your party doing on Y? Oh, I really liked the policy you passed at conference. We're going to try and pick that up for ours. That kind of thing. It does happen. And I think it should happen. Like Jen said, if we can strengthen the LGBT organisations in other parties, then we don't have to worry about our human rights, whoever gets in.
I think one of the things that one of the things that I'm kind of much more aware of now, I have a few friends who are gay and in the Tories, and who are in Labour and bisexual. And I think a couple of years ago I was very reluctant generally, because my view tended to be, well, why would you be LGBT plus and in the Tories? Why would it? And yes, okay, I still have certain reservations about, I don't understand, but that doesn't mean that it's not a reason to work with people. And I think we should look at it as, in the same way that, although the Lib Dems has generally been great and has done so much for LGBT plus rights, that we still have to, there are still people in the party who have to push back against resistance from other members. And I think it's worth us remembering that, in the same way that we don't necessarily agree with everything our party does, there are people in, Labour, and I think particularly the Tories, just because of, the general stance, that we should remember that they are doing the same thing, and they don't necessarily agree with all of the policies of their party. And actually, they are those people who are pushing back against the party and trying to move them towards a more reasonable position as a minimum requirement, on LGBT rights. And that we should kind of respect that. And as Jenny said, try and build kind of stronger LGBT societies, organisations within other parties, so that we can support them in that, because there are people who are probably facing a lot more resistance than we do within our party, but who are still there. And in the same way that I have felt over the last couple of years, when there have been points when I've thought, should I be in the party? Because yes, I'm closest to them politically, but there are things I really don't agree with, and have always come to the conclusion that actually there need to be people who disagree, because there need to be people who are pushing for what we think is right. And there are those people in other parties who think, okay, yes, I am really disappointed and angry at what, other people in my party, I think particularly, I go back to again, particularly in the Tories, who are angry at the stance their party take, but think, well, if I leave, and if everyone else leaves, and the majority of LGBT plus people leave the party, then who is there to stand up for our rights and make sure that we're pushed more towards a better stance? And there have to be people who think, well, I'm just going to have to weather this, and actually it might not be great, but somebody's got to do it. And I've kind of, now I'm a bit more understanding of that, and much more pro working with other parties on those issues, whereas before I kind of thought, well, what's the point, which is never the solution. And kind of having got to know those people, it again comes back to knowing people personally, and knowing people's personal stories makes such a big difference in kind of the way I've seen the kind of how we work with other people in the political landscape in terms of LGBT issues within their parties.
Absolutely, Lucy. I mean, it makes me think of how back before his fall from grace, Chris Huhne always used to talk about the liberal diaspora of people who share a lot of our values, particularly on social issues, spread across not just the Lib Dems, but across Parliament, in Labour, in the Conservatives, implied in the SNP. That this is a wider thing, that as a party that is unfortunately unlikely within the next 2 years, let's say, to have a parliamentary majority, that nonetheless it's that reaching out and finding where are the common grounds and what are the common experiences. And in the same way as I was saying about the the peer education project within the Liberal Party about lesbian and gay rights in the 70s, the other parties, please steal, borrow, replicate as much as you can if it's going to achieve these goals, that we want to see what they're doing and steal their best practice to try and make sure that right across the whole spectrum, these things are being moved forward regardless of party politics and what you think the base rate of income tax ought to be. Moving up a little bit to the other thing that Owen asked us about, though, because I faintly remember the question, there's another thing which is, I think, particularly Labour that we could learn from. Labour are really good at networking with each other in people who are in different LGBT organisations. The number of times I've been at some meeting of, people who are involved in various LGBT groups, and you kind of work out that little huddle over there is a little Labour clique catching up on what happened at CLP meetings last weekend or whatever. And I think within the Lib Dems, we're much less good at that. We don't have that almost that knowledge of who each other are. I'm guessing and hoping that the set of sort of social activities and so on that Plus is developing this year, that's been largely, a tiny silver lining from the COVID cloud, as Plus is an organisation with hundreds of members but spread over 650 seats, we can be quite thin on the ground. And the shift towards having those kind of online meetings means that now if you are the only Plus member in your village, you can still connect with and get to know some things about who else is out there. But I think as well as talking about that kind of, how is this policy motion going sort of thing, getting to know more of each other's backlives and backstories, maybe we could start to replicate some of that for us. What do you think about Motion 7 for Federal Conference and whatever, and build up some of that kind of connection within queer cultural spaces for ourselves as liberals as well?
Absolutely fantastic. No, that's quite reassuring to hear, actually, because I think a lot of what I hear can be quite divisive, especially among some of my personal friends who are always very much on the lines of, oh well, if you want to support LGBT plus rights, you've got to throw all your eggs in the Labour basket. But in reality, we all want to see our rights, not pushed, but also protected. That's the thing. Equality is, equality, as Bernard Grieve said in that meeting. But there we are. I think that's a fantastic place for us to draw the line and get on with our afternoons here today. I'd love to thank all of our panelists here who came and joined us for a real insight. Honestly, I mean, I sometimes, even as an LGBT plus member of the Lib Dems, sometimes I'm not really sure what Plus is doing. So it's been really fantastic to hear exactly what's been going on and exactly where we'll be heading in the future. So thank you very much to all our listeners who have listened to the Lib Dem pod today across all your streaming services, all of us who got to see our lovely faces on YouTube. Sadly, if you didn't see us on say Spotify, please do pop over and have a look on the old interwebs. I've been Owen Lambert, and you've been listening to Lib Dem Podcast. Thank you very much.